Winter is fast approaching in my Colorado garden, and after 2 full growing seasons in my garden greenhouse, I've learned a lot. Join me today as I share with you 12 lessons that will help you with your greenhouse success. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and this is not my first greenhouse. For 5 years, I grew in a very large dome greenhouse, 22 feet high and 42 feet in diameter. It presented many challenges to have successful gardening within a greenhouse that big. Completely different from my backyard and this unheated small greenhouse. Surprisingly, an unheated greenhouse can warm up extremely quickly once the sun rises in the morning. And being aware of what the temperature is inside the greenhouse is critical during the growing season. That means having a thermometer in your greenhouse is a necessity. Now, I like having a remote sensor. This measures the temperature and sends it inside the house. So at all times of the day while I'm inside, I know exactly what the temperature is in my greenhouse. I had a wall-mounted digital thermometer in my big dome greenhouse without wireless readings because I learned in time that that big space stayed relatively consistent with the temperature. It was almost always 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the outside air. But in a small greenhouse, the temperature can vary dramatically from minute to minute. So being able to be in the house and note those changes is important going into lesson number 2. The ventilation in the greenhouse is critical in managing the greenhouse temperature. I have some vents in my greenhouse. I have one that has an automatic arm that will open and close based on the temperature inside the greenhouse. And then I have another one that is operated manually. But those 2 vents are not enough to cool this greenhouse down, even on cold winter days. Just a few days ago, the temperature outside was around freezing. The temperature with these doors closed and the vent open was over 100 degrees. That means every day I need to come out and get additional ventilation in this greenhouse. For me, that means upper and lower doors. On the cold winter days, I can usually get by with just opening the doors on one end. That'll manage the temperature pretty well inside. But on hot summer days with the sun shining, I also need to open the doors on this end to try to get the air flowing through. Even with both ends open and both vents open, inside the greenhouse is still going to be about 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the outside air temperature. Most gardeners are aware that a greenhouse gets hot and can stay hot, but the opposite holds true as well. Unheated greenhouses can get cold and stay cold. So something needs to be done to help increase the temperature inside on the coldest days. I do that a few different ways. I have almost 250 gallons of water stored in this greenhouse. I have gravel around the base of these barrels, and I have these concrete pavers. All of these will absorb the sun's energy during the day and then release it at night, helping to stabilize the greenhouse. With active management of the heat within the greenhouse through the ventilation and the passive heating system I have, I am able to extend my growing season on the front side and on the back side. But this is an unheated greenhouse. That means it does get cold in here at night. While I can keep the temperature above freezing for much of the year, it still gets very cold. I am often asked about starting seeds inside my greenhouse. Well, during spring, at the prime seed starting season, it's still too cold at night. It's above freezing, but it's not warm enough to germinate most of the seeds that I'm starting ahead of time. So I still have to do that indoors. The greenhouse is not a magic factor when it comes to seed starting if it's unheated. But an unheated greenhouse can be ideal for hardening off plants in spring. For the last 2 years, this is where I hardened off my plants. They were exposed to a full day of sun, cooler temperatures at night, and it was less stressful than the harsh temperature changes and strong winds that I typically get during the hardening off season. I found that the plants I hardened off inside this greenhouse performed much better than plants that I hardened off outside the greenhouse. I've enjoyed that the management of the temperature in my greenhouse has given me extended seasons. I was harvesting peppers and tomatoes weeks after I got my first frost. And I'm still harvesting strawberries in my green stalk tower that's inside the greenhouse. My green stalks outside have already frozen. So getting that extension of the season really helps make some of the extra work quite worthwhile. Extra growing in spring and fall is great, but growing during the summer can be a challenge inside this greenhouse just because it gets so hot, even with all of my efforts to use the good ventilation. I also have shade cloth. The shade cloth I have spread inside the greenhouse also helps keep it cooler on the hottest summer days. And I think it adds an extra layer of insulation. It traps the hottest air at the very top of the greenhouse. During the winter months, it's really not a problem. The sun is much lower in the sky, and it can shine through the sides and heat up the greenhouse during the day. Shade is a factor that is often overlooked inside the greenhouse. I knew that the shade cloth would make a difference, but this year I realized very much how the plants will cast beneficial shade. Last year I was growing black cherry tomato plants here, and they filled this space. And they were growing extremely well throughout the summer and even into December. The bulk of those plants shaded themselves from the excess sun, and they also helped to trap some of that heat at night. These plants are different varieties of tomatoes, and they didn't get as big. They suffered throughout the summer because they didn't have that built-in shade factor. And once the temperature began to drop near freezing inside here, all of these plants suffered. I think a lot of gardeners get a greenhouse assuming that it's going to be very humid inside because a lot of big industrial operations have high humidity. But in a smaller unheated greenhouse, particularly one that is open at both ends with the vents open as well, the inside air isn't going to be much more humid than the outside air. And with the breeze blowing through, things are actually going to dry out very quickly inside the greenhouse. So I found that even with a mulch on my soil, I had to water every single day. The soil just dried out quickly. I have a lot of organic matter in the soil, but that organic matter and mulch wasn't enough because it was so warm and so much airflow that the soil was drying out. So be ready for extra watering, even more than might be needed in the greater garden. That's another benefit for having the big plants shading the ground. This year, I definitely had to water much more than last year, even though the plants were smaller. Keeping the soil moist for the plants is always a concern, particularly during the spring and fall. In my region, The nights have dropped below freezing every night, 4 weeks. How do I get water to the greenhouse? Well, during the summer, it's a hose from the faucet. That hose is frozen and disconnected. That now means I have to hand water everything in the greenhouse. I have some Chicago figs growing in this bed. They've started to go dormant, but they're still alive. The soil can't dry out. The strawberries in this greenstock tower are also still growing. That means periodically I have to bring water out here to water these plants. All of those plants growing in early spring and then late fall and early winter are probably going to need to be watered by hand. This adds extra effort, but I don't have a buried water line, and it's really my only option. Something you need to consider in an unheated greenhouse in a cold region. A very valid concern and a question that should be asked when thinking about a greenhouse is it worth the cost? This is a heavy-duty Planta greenhouse. It wasn't cheap. It can stand up to many feet of snow and very heavy winds and was ideal for my garden. It took me almost 20 years to save up and finally reach the point where it fit within my gardening budget. Was it worth it? Yes, I think so. I have harvested tomatoes in December. I've hardened off my plants weeks before I could do it without the greenhouse. The amount of plants that I can grow in here isn't a lot because I've got so much space devoted to my bench and my water. But that's beside the point. I'm a gardener who likes to get outside and garden. And this gives me that opportunity. This gives me just a few weeks on the front and the back, but for an avid gardener, those extra couple weeks are worth just about any cost. So, the greenhouse is one of the best decisions I've made in recent years, and I wish I would have done it sooner. A benefit that I didn't expect was that the greenhouse gives me someplace to go in winter. When it's too cold to really spend much time outside, I can come into the greenhouse. I have a workbench here. I can make notes when it comes to planning my spring and summer garden. And there are days when the wind is howling and the snow is falling, when it's just fun to be in a greenhouse where it's nice and warm and cozy. And even if the plants aren't actively growing, it's still part of my garden, and I can soak up all that beneficial garden energy. So the greenhouse in winter is actually one of my favorite gardening times of the year. What lessons have you learned if you've been growing in a greenhouse? I'd like to find out what they are and share them with everyone else. These are some of the lessons that I've picked up over the last couple years, and there's a lot more to learn and a long way to go. But the greenhouse is giving me a great opportunity to grow and learn and enjoy gardening. I'm Gardener Scott. If you want to see more about some of my greenhouse growing, watch one of these videos next.